appreciative of everyone coming out in 100-degree heat tonight to hear the second of our third of our 3 talks about Radnor and the Revolution this summer. Featured or based on Mr. Dallett's book that was done for the bicentennial, and then updated by our wonderful member Phil Graham, so that actually has color pages and things that the young kids expect a book to look like these days. I also appreciate everybody noticing the messages we sent out and everything today, saying that we didn't want everybody sitting out in the heat. I was afraid someone would keel over. So if you haven't had the ice cream in the back, please make sure you get some. My nieces are visiting here from Toledo, Ohio this weekend, and they made it for us this morning. Yes, so thank you to them for all their hard work. They mixed everything right, and we poured it in, and then they pressed start on the electric ice cream mixer. So it worked very, very well. Tonight, as you well know, our friend and excellent speaker, Jim Segrave-Daly, is going to talk about the second part of the book. Jim is a Historical Society member and a volunteer board member of the Haverford Township Historical Society, America 250 PA Delco Volunteer, which is also sponsored by the Historical Society, and we just put out the book that is going to be part of that event this year, and I'll be sending an email out about that in the next week or two. Jim is the creator and presenter of History for Shut-ins on Facebook and YouTube, American Revolutionary Roundtable Philadelphia member, volunteer history teacher at Haverford Township Adult School, and history presenter to libraries and civic groups nationwide, and most importantly, the father of a teenage daughter. I say that every time.
Who isn't here despite there being ice cream.
She
chose to go to the beach instead.
We're going to the beach tomorrow. We delayed it a day so that we could be here. But before Jim talks, we have a very, very special guest tonight. Jim met Mr. Dallett's cousin, Tad Philippone. And Tad was a teacher and knew Jim very well and is going to talk about him for a minute, right?
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
If I can pop up there to give you an idea of how long ago Jim was. I was a teenager when I met Jim Dallett. By the way, not that Jim.
Right.
We always referred to Mr. Dallett as Jim Dallett. He was a distant cousin of mine, and when I was a kid, my grandmother decided that something I'd said or looked at or enjoyed, that the two of us should connect. And we met, and he brought me into the Athenaeum, which is a great institution on Washington Square in Philadelphia. I instantly fell in love with the Athenaeum. He then brought me over to his office in, which at that point was under Franklin Field, in the archives of the University of Pennsylvania. And he was so interested in genealogy and history, and he was such a consummate gentleman in every respect. And he got me fired up about history, and I taught history for 50 years. I was the dean at Deerfield Academy and assistant headmaster of the Hill School. But the real joy in my life was teaching history, and it was all due to Jim Dallett. He got me interested in genealogy, and so I ended up joining the Sons of the Revolution and finding out that 2 of my ancestors were ambassadors to the United States during Jefferson's administration. He just was fascinating. He could just light a fire under people and get them to appreciate our past. And we're surrounded by it here. We live surrounded by history. And of course we've got it in our blood and our bones as well. So I'm so grateful that Jim is dedicating this series of talks to Jim. And I'm very proud of my cousin, and I'm glad to see such a large, wonderful group here to enjoy the history as well. Stay cool.
Thank you, Tad. Caroline Yarnell Casey Brandt said to me, if Mr. Dallett didn't know about Philadelphia history, it was not worth knowing. So I think that goes along with what Tad just told us. So now we're going to bring on our featured speaker of the evening, Mr. Jim Segrave-Daly. Please give a warm welcome to my friend.
Thank you,
Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Those who've seen me speak previously know how difficult it is for me to sit down and not move, so I'm going to try to do this. I want to thank Pam and Radnor Memorial Library also for being a great partner for having or providing the opportunity for these types of talks. Despite it being 95 and, you know, all the other things going on in life, I look forward to these opportunities because I love, much like Tad had said, he was inspired by his cousin. I don't know who inspired me. I have several family members here, so I have to be careful. But I've always loved history, so, you know, just I feel very much the same way Tad does about it. So what we're going to do, in our first session, we had talked about several of the sites locally. And what I've done, this is a pamphlet that Jennifer and Radnor Historical Society have available. So here, this should be interesting, me trying to multimedia this thing here. But this is the pamphlet itself. And what's fascinating about this, I've probably read this about 6 or 7 times. And of course, each time I read it, I learn something new. Mr. Daly did this without, and maybe this is a good thing, there's no internet, there's no, right? Like, thank God there's no Wikipedia when he's doing all this research and checking archives and those sorts of things. So really solid, old school research. And just the information that he shares in these 21 pages is fascinating and really has led me down into several other areas of interest. And again, those who've also seen me talk, you know, although we're going to be talking about one thing, I tend to go down a rabbit hole or two along the way. So please stop me if you have questions or comments. We'll talk for about an hour or so, but don't wait until the end. If you have a question, raise your hand, we'll address it. And quite frankly, your question might be, as painful as it is for me to say this, your question might be a lot more interesting than what I'm going to talk about. So thank you very much for being here. What we're going to do actually is we're going to kind of start at the end. We're at the point where Washington and the Continental troops are at White Marsh, right? So we're post Brandywine. We are post Paoli Massacre. We are post Battle of the Clouds. We are post Battle of Germantown. So we're just approaching that November, December 1777 time frame, where Washington's troops now, the British have taken over Philadelphia, okay, and Washington's happy to let them have it. Washington and his troops are at this point up at Plymouth White Marsh. They are going to make the 13-mile trek to Valley Forge, which we could probably drive in, well, depending on, you know, how fast we drive and how many traffic laws we disobey, maybe, you know, half an hour, let's say, or maybe a little bit more. It took them 3 weeks to march 13 miles. Now, granted, they have the largest army in the world snipping at their heels, right, in the British. So there are concerns about that. The other thing, a constant theme throughout this time for Washington and his troops, food, ammunition, fuel, wood, you know, provisions. So as they are trying to live off of the land, they're running into difficulties because, you know, much of the local populace, at this point in the war, things are not going very well. So there are some people who are staunch loyalists who say, hey, it really looks like Washington had a great run. You know, we have Trenton, we have Princeton, we have, you know, late 1776 or early 1777 when things were going well. Things aren't going well now. So you may have people who 8, 10, 12 months before were pro, you know, Continental Army who are now saying, oh my gosh, it looks like the game is almost up. So what they are doing is they are selling provisions to the British. One being, they think the British are going to win. 2, the British are paying in hard currency. The Americans are handing over pieces of paper that say, hey, for your fence posts, we're going to owe you money. Many of those IOUs are never turned in after the war. And during the war, Continental script is about as valuable as it's probably more valuable than my notes, but, you know, not worth a lot of money because it's not really backed by anything, right? So you have shifting alliances throughout. What Washington and his troops their big struggle is trying to feed and clothe and house, and it's a constant theme throughout this period. And as we had talked about in the first session of this, they're going, what Washington and his army did is basically they drew a 70-mile circle around, from this area. And that's as far out as they were going to try to get supplies, right? So with the British in Philadelphia, they've got Philly locked down, right? And probably New Jersey as well, the Garden State, which provided a lot of food and other materials. Washington, where he and the troops are running into the British, and where they're focusing a lot of attention, via Daniel Morgan, one of the heroes of Saratoga, is in Chester County, trying to keep the British out of Chester County from coming up and buying horses and cows and all these sorts of things, okay? Washington, when he gets to Valley Forge, it's December 19th, 1777. Now, we've all heard the stories growing up about they're eating bark and they're not, all these horrible stories, right? They actually were not, and that their morale was extremely low. Morale was actually decent because, as we talked in the last class, there were a couple of skirmishes, and there's actually one shortly from this time frame between Light Horse Harry Lee, who is Robert E. Lee's father, who is a favorite of Washington, right? Light Horse Harry Lee. He actually has a skirmish with Bannister Tarleton, who's the head of British cavalry just down the road in Easttown. And it's on what's called Scott's Farm. Lee wins that very minor skirmish, but it provides a psychological lift to the Continental Army because things have been going so bad for the past 3, 4, 5 months. What Lee does is he renames Scott's Farm Tarleton Farm, kind of as a big you-know-what to Bannister Tarleton, who he beat. Later, a school is founded on the site, which is since moved, Tarleton School. That's why it's named that, for Bannister Tarleton, who was, basically the devil incarnate in the Continental soldiers' eyes, because what he did is he would not allow soldiers to surrender. There was what was called Tarleton's Quarter. He would basically kill any Continental soldier who said, "I give up, I'm done." He'd bayonet him, whatever it did, because his thought was, I want him off the field. And it wasn't very gentlemanly, right? So, Washington, once they are established in Valley Forge, ultimately it swells to about 20,000 people, and a lot of that is, so the majority are troops, and there are troops still coming in, various militia units, right, that are coming in, but you have camp followers, you have families that have traveled, which is amazing, that are traveling with their family member soldier. You have freed blacks, you have slaves, so it swells to 20,000 people. At the time, when Valley Forge is at that number, it's the 4th largest city in the colonies. It's crazy, right? Philadelphia, New York, Boston maybe, Charleston or Savannah, and then Valley Forge. So really, like, something to think about here. That winter, it wasn't the coldest, but there was a lot of rain and precipitation. So think of if you don't have shoes, if you don't have the proper clothing, if you're not properly housed. Now, for those, and I'm sure we've been up to Valley Forge, at some point you see the log huts, right? Thousands of log huts are built on the grounds to house the men. And in some instances, they have up to about 15 men. You see the size of those huts. They're representative of what was built during the day. Imagine, I'm from a family of 11, so 13 with my parents. There were times it felt like we were living in a house residence, right? But imagine you have upwards of 15 soldiers living together. Disease is rampant in the Army. And through any war, quite frankly, from the Revolution moving forward, the #1 killer of troops is disease. You get shot, you have an infection, right? Because they don't have the medical technology, the medication, the knowledge that we have today. Well, what you have back then as well is you have farm boys who have traveled no farther than 5 miles from their home, who are now with guys who live in Philadelphia or New York or Boston who have been exposed to more. So once a pathogen hits a certain, whether it's a person or a hut or an area of the camp, it's going to wipe guys out. Smallpox is still a big problem, right? Tuberculosis, a big problem. All these sorts of diseases that are running through the ranks. Provisions for Valley Forge are actually available in the early months of camp. And think about it, initially, we'd said that about 12,000 men show up, right? Well, add another, I'm really bad at math, so whatever 8,000 more is out of 12,000, I have a history degree, not a math degree. So what is that, 40%? It's more than, actually it's more than 50, sorry, my brother-in-law's an accountant here and is frowning as I'm talking. So whatever that number is, it's a lot, right? Maybe it's 60%, so add 60% more to that 12,000 who are using a finite amount of supplies. That's when you start to run into problems. The other issue, one among many, was sanitation. And this kind of runs into the disease thread that I was talking about. There's no idea of germs and pathogens and how diseases are spread, right? So lousy sanitation, guys are, not to be graphic, hopefully you're not eating ice cream, but guys are literally stepping outside of their, or in the hut saying, hey, it's too cold to go outside. There are no outhouses, so all of these things are going on, right? And it's amazing that they're able to get through, but there are several very good reasons why. You've got, so the huts that I mentioned, they were actually 14 feet by 16 feet. That's the size of a small living room today, right? Probably even smaller than that, or very small living room. But you've got all these guys cramped into those spaces. More than 2,000 huts are built at Valley Forge during the winter. So landowners aren't happy because their trees are being cut down left and right. The other thing that's happening, and I had mentioned it earlier, fence posts are being taken by both the British and the Americans for fuel, right? Because if you cut down a tree, as a pyromaniac, I know this, you have to let the wood weather, right? Well, if you cut down a tree and it's fresh, it's not going to burn well. But if you take a fence post that's been exposed to weather for God knows how long, it's going to burn great. So the men dug miles of trenches. There were 5 earthen forts, also known as redoubts, which are also used, they're really used throughout the war. If you've seen any documentary on the period, a redoubt basically is a hill of dirt, and there are usually what's called bateaux sticking out of them, spiked wooden posts, as a way to slow oncoming troops. And what the defensive troops would do is they would stand behind the redoubt and fire. Because if you're coming at that redoubt, you're going to slow down, right? And redoubts were actually based on what had been used during the Roman Empire. So these things were moved forward. There were 18 landowners within the current design of Valley Forge National Park. None of them were happy that Washington was there. Whether they were a patriot, a loyalist, whatever it may be. Because what they're saying is, one, their trees are being cut down, their land is being utilized and destroyed. The Continental Army saying, here, after the war, we'll pay you. Doesn't happen, right? So all these things are going on. There was an ironworks named, anyone want to guess?
Wood.
And ultimately it's then named Valley Forge. Yes, very good. So a small industrial village with charcoal houses is set up. So all these, they're trying to set up a self-sustaining way of keeping the camp together. Flu, typhoid killed more than 2,000 people, as well as other diseases. So again, that's a pretty big number. It's basically 10% of that 20,000. That I know is right. Washington is having a brutal time with Congress. Now remember, with the British in Philadelphia, Congress headed west through Radnor and as fast as they could run out to York, Lancaster, that area. So Washington throughout the war has been sending letters to Congress. I need help, I need money, I need this, I need that. Congress at the time has no power to tax, right? Each state governor has more power than the Continental Congress. So if Washington reaches out to state governors, he does this as well. If he reaches out to the New York state governor, many times the New York state governor's answer was, I will send you supplies, but they're not for Pennsylvania troops, they're for my troops. And think of the mindset, my troops, right? My New York troops. So he's got all of these things that he is working against. Big savior who steps into the fray at Valley Forge is Baron von Steuben. Von Steuben, you say tomato, I say tomato, right? He is a Prussian, he presents himself as a Prussian military officer. He basically padded his resume. But Washington is desperate for help. What he does, what von Steuben does, is out of all the madness and disorganization, he molds the Continental Army into a fighting unit. Simple drills, sanitation. This is, latrines should not be dug next to the log huts. They should be out here. Again, simple ideas. Different reforms, and he brings a European mindset to the troops at Valley Forge. And what that does is it helps the Continental Army mature into a fighting force. Von Steuben produces a manual that was used by the U.S. Army, and really I shouldn't say the Army, the military, for 100 plus years after the founding of the nation. It was used at West Point. So he plays a huge role for some guy who really had no military experience, right? It's just amazing stuff. What he does is he says, soldiers, and he saw this as both a blessing and a curse. He said, Continental soldiers are not going to submit to harsh European-style discipline. Because some of these guys, what they would do is they'd just say, hey, I'm out, I'm leaving, I'm done. I don't have to listen to you. Because again, that mindset is, well, I'm a New Yorker, and I answer to Tad, who's my colonel from New York, right? I'm not listening to or answering to a higher power. That's how some of them thought. It was very provincial. He realizes, and he works very closely with Washington. And of course, Washington is thrilled because something else that we had mentioned, Washington was not, he hated, as I think we all do, bureaucracy, paperwork, administration, those sorts of things, which is why he also, Alexander Hamilton plays a big role. Hamilton loves that stuff, eats it up, right? It's like the friend we had growing up who, maybe did your book report or what, I'm being facetious, but did the tasks that you did not like to do. So what it does is it frees Washington to look at some of the other areas where he can focus his energies. Let me see here. Bear with me. Any questions as I'm looking here? Any questions, any comments? Feel free, please. Yes? Yes?
Okay. Why at the time did the British not think of attacking Valley Forge? Weren't they strong enough? They knew they were there.
They actually, very good question. And I think so they outnumbered Washington at this point. And think of, and I've always questioned this too, especially after what happened at the end of 1776, right? When they're in Trenton and they're, comfortable, they're thinking, oh, there's not going to be a battle, it's winter, it's horrible, we're not quite at that point of the weather cycle, so it's always baffled me as well that they have not gone in and basically they take Washington off the board or his army off the board, that's a big, big piece, right? And it's not as though they're up in New York, they're, Philly to Valley Forge, right?
Well, there was supposedly a skirmish, I think, at Liberty Hill.
Yes.
Where actually a couple of the revolution, our side died. I don't know if they were British soldiers, so they were, what do you call it? Not just skirmishes, when groups went out to reconnoiter.
Absolutely, and so that also goes into the looking for supplies. So what Washington did is he sent groups out under Morgan. So Morgan, for a period, commanded the Radnor picket. And Morgan, the great wagoneer, from Virginia, he's got Morgan's riflemen, right, who are crack shots and played a big role at Saratoga. They play a big role, they're gonna play a huge role in the Southern campaign at Guilford Courthouse and Cowpens and all those other areas, right? I don't think there's a good answer. Part of it, and this is just me theorizing, which with $1 might get you a cup of coffee at Wawa, right? But I think it's pride too, in that the British are saying, you know what, we're better than these guys. If we get our act together, we can beat them. And think of, again, starting at Brandywine in September of 1777, they have about a 5-week stretch, win, 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 right? With Paoli, with Battle of the Clouds, which technically isn't a battle, right? But even Germantown, which, Washington and the Continental start out well, but plans just, in the fog of war, literally the fog of war, things go badly. So, and I think another piece, so I know I'm kind of skirting around your question, but I don't know that there's one silver bullet answer. I think the other thing, when the Howes first came over, they were assigned as commissioners to try to get the Americans not to fight. So after Bunker Hill, which is a very costly victory for the British, right? They make 3 charges. Third charge, they take the hill, but they lose, casualties of 1,000 men. And it shows the Americans, hey, we can fight with these guys. We can hang with these guys, which I think Washington overextends into the Battle of Long Island, because he's not at Breed's Hill, right? He hears all these stories. So I think there are several reasons why. The other thing that always puzzled me is just the British fascination with, we're gonna take New York, we're gonna take Philadelphia. They tried to take Boston initially, right? But thanks to Henry Knox and the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, they ultimately leave. They take Savannah, they take Charleston. They're very big on taking, a city, for lack of a better term, right? A city center. And not only say, hey, we've taken over this area, but also psychologically think of, hey, we've taken the rebel capital of Philadelphia. Well, they're gone within about 6 to 8 months, and they say, we're just gonna hightail it back to New York. So, yes?
So why did they decide, did Washington's army or Washington decide to go from Plymouth White Marsh to Valley Forge? Why were they planning to stay there? What were they planning to do, to
So
do
one,
next?
for protection, because they felt they were protected by, the topography, the river system, right, the Schuylkill and whatnot. And again, think of it, it took them 3 weeks to go 13 miles, right? So the British are a little further beyond that in Philadelphia. So he's thinking, and with the pickets that have been set up, he's saying, if they come our way, I'm going to know about it. The other really cool thing, I had mentioned it in the last presentation, was that the Americans had set up a signaling system, because they were afraid if they sent Jim out with battle plans or a note for Washington, I could be captured by the British, and then they know what's going on. So their signaling system, and I have it written down here, I'll give you the more specifics. It started in Newtown Square and worked its way to Valley Forge, and basically they were known as Washington's beacons. So you had men, tallest tree on the highest hill would have a torch or some illuminating object to say, and it's almost like one if by land, two if by sea, and it was really to let Washington and his troops know that the British were on the move. They were more concerned about provisioning, because they also thought the British in the north really did not have a good history, or even, what's the word I want? There wasn't a precedence of them fighting in the winter, right? So Washington, to a degree, felt that he was okay and allowed him to regroup and those sorts of things. Now down south, it's a different story because the weather's different, the roads they're not great, but they're a little bit more passable. But yeah, again, they're so close to each other that you would think the British would be more, again, they've got Washington on the ropes, and they never really finish it.
So what was the plan, to stay there until the summer?
Stay there, well, and Baron von Steuben, he has no idea he's showing up until he shows up. Once he shows up, Washington says, okay, I'm going to put you to work to get my guys into some sort of fighting shape. The British help the Americans out big time when they abandon Philadelphia and they say, we're just going to go back up to New York, and Washington and his troops are on the British heels and they meet at Monmouth Courthouse. And it's there that the British say in June, day like today, guys wearing woolen uniforms and carrying, 40, 50 pounds of stuff, guys dying of heat stroke. It's there that the British say, this fighting force is not the same force we fought in Germantown. And it's because of von Steuben and the things that he had put into place. Yes, sir.
Question, crossing the Schuylkill from White Marsh to Valley Forge in that 13-week period.
Yes.
How hard was it logistically to cross the Schuylkill River?
Some guys are chest high, holding, and again, think woolen uniforms, if they're lucky enough to have one, right? Some guys are, and again, it's been romanticized, but some guys are in rags, no shoes, like, I wouldn't go in the Schuylkill today, it's 95 degrees out, right? But think of back then, it's just brutal. You're also, they're carrying their muskets, they're trying to keep their powder dry. They also, again, they have no idea. They know the British are in Philly, but they don't know, is there a reconnoitering party a mile away? We have no clue. So just think of like the fear and the stress and everything that they are encountering, which, today we may not think about. Our stress is when we have to hop on the Schuylkill Expressway and get down into Philadelphia in less than an hour, right? But not to be facetious, but no, just all of these things, which you don't think about, but it's just another challenge that they encounter and ultimately overcome, thank goodness. So, oh yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, in answer to the question about the British attacking Washington Valley Forge, are you familiar with the farm called Fatlands?
I am.
And the story of General Howe visiting?
So share it, if you will, please, go ahead.
Well,
Oh, no, go ahead. No, go for it. I'm going to take a sip of water. So I don't know about Howe visiting, but initially that was the target, was this Fatlands farm. That was Washington's target at Valley Forge. But of course, as more people were coming in, more troops, more camp followers and whatnot, they're spread out a heck of a lot more than he may have initially thought. So I don't know the specifics of the meeting. If you do, please.
There's a ford there, it gets shallow and you cross the river. And right around a couple, maybe 10 days after, right around Christmas time. So it was very soon after Washington settled on Valley Forge. General Howe and some of his staff went out and had dinner with the owner, a guy named George Vall, who was very, owned a lot of property, successful planter.
Right.
And it's assumed that they discussed Vall letting the British troops attack Valley Forge through the Fatlands, which would have been kind of an end around and a good place to ford the river. And apparently Washington, they knew what each other was doing all the time.
Right.
And the British had a pretty good idea of what was at Valley Forge, even though they didn't have that 3-to-1 advantage in numbers to make it a successful attack. But Washington had dinner with George Vall the very next night.
Okay.
And that seemed to satisfy any possibility of a British attack.
Gotcha. And the way that you're describing it's basically what happened at Brandywine, right? Certain fords were guarded, but fords to the north of Brandywine weren't, and that's what the British got around, because Washington had bad intelligence, and that's ultimately what leads to the loss there. But thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. So Couple other things, and then I promise we will talk more about Radnor. I've got photos I want to show that I couldn't show at the first, just some of the sites that we had talked about, which we drive by every day, and quite frankly, it's cool. My sister, one of my sisters is in from California, and on the way up, drove by, and I told her, I said, I'm really sorry, but this is what you get for coming to a talk with me, so I was pointing things out to her on the way up. So there was a couple things happen while Washington is at Valley Forge. So throughout the war, there are questions of, is Washington the right guy? Which sounds like, to me, that's heresy, right? But in the heat of the moment, because Washington, he won enough, but he lost more than he won, right? So there's always, and particularly after, think of where we are, December of 1777. What happens in October of 1777 in upstate New York? Battle of Saratoga, right? Henry Knox is the head there, but we know it's really more Morgan, Benedict Arnold of all people, right? Who played very key roles in the battle there. But there's talk of, or not Knox, I'm sorry. Who's the gentleman?
Gates.
Thank you, Gates. Jeez Louise. This will be my last presentation for but Jim, my membership's got to be doubled, right? My membership fee, sorry. And it's being taped, even better. But no, so Gates, yeah. So the thought is, Gates can lead the troops. So there is something called the Conway Cabal, where some of his officers talk about, hey, we're going to replace Washington. You also had, not here, but a little bit later in the war, what was known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, where again, officers get together and say, hey, maybe George isn't quite up to snuff here. So, but Washington diffuses it, retains the commander-in-chief position, and what happens is his reputation grows. Something that helps. Now, I have denigrated Congress, rightfully so, not today's, but the Continental Congress, because they were quick to run and really, again, had no power. So they were limited by their own design. A Continental congressional delegation actually comes to Valley Forge, and some of them are shocked by what they see. They're like, wow, General Washington, you're not full of baloney. You're actually telling us some of the bad things that are happening here, and we believe you. So it helps in his communication with them. It doesn't, supplies don't start falling out of the sky, but Washington's message starts to have more impact and get through to Congress. Washington, there's a reorganization of the Army with Congress taking some of the administrative burden away, which helps in the long run. The other thing is that Valley Forge is really seen as, now although Washington is made commander-in-chief in June of 1775, right? Right after, just before the Battle of Bunker Hill in Philadelphia, the Continental Convention. Valley Forge is seen as the birthplace of the American Army, the true birthplace, because before then it's disparate groups of militia. Yes, there are some Continental soldiers, but it's here with von Steuben and how he molds a fighting force, that the concepts of basic training, those who have served, thank you for your service. But think of when you first enlisted, you went to basic training, right? You learned how to march and fire a gun and all these other things. Before von Steuben, it was, hi, I'm from Havertown, Pennsylvania, and I'm here for the fight. There's no training. It's, you stand here, take a shot or two, and if you're still alive, run behind the veteran troops who are going to encounter the British. Von Steuben is the man who turns all these things around. You get a professional officers corps, Nathaniel Greene, some of the other great names. Greene is just a fascinating guy to read more about. But before then it was, and we see it really through the Civil War as well. See it a lot in the Civil War. generals who have political connections, right? They have no military experience, which is why it's such a, initially until really Grant gets involved and Grant is in place with Sherman, that, those difficulties are overcome. Have any of you heard of the Newport High House out in Chesterbrook? French engineer who founds the Army Corps of Engineers at Valley Forge. So these sorts of things. It's also his seed of an idea that brings about West Point. So just all these things are happening. And it's because of what happens at Valley Forge that the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse and the Southern strategy that I had alluded to are such successes, because the American Army is a more professional army. Again, they may not be quite as good as the British, but they've closed that gap. And Howe talks about it regularly. Cornwallis talks about it regularly and says, these aren't farmers with pitchforks anymore. These guys are a completely different force. So, thank you for letting me go backwards here, which again, my two sisters here would tell you that's part of the course with me. But what we'll do, I want to show a couple of photos, and this is so the Radnor Historical Society has this pamphlet available for $15. I'm going to show just a few items. There's just so many great photos here, and bear with my lack of technical knowledge. But here, so first photo. Oh, I gave it away. I was going to ask you if you knew what it was. So, again, you get what you pay for, free ice cream and me. So, Radnor Friends Meeting House is used as a headquarters and a hospital during the war. Look at, you see how big it is, right? It's amazing. And this was Conestoga, and what is it? Sproul, is it?
Yes.
And this is another site I pointed out to my lovely sister on the way up here. But yes,
Yeah.
so almost like right under, is it just off of, what's that overpass? Is that the Blue Route?
It
I should
is,
know, I've
yes.
only lived here 20 plus years, or 30. But yeah, and the spot where it is, you can drive right by it. It's right by the Ithan Market, that small market. You drive by and you're like, oh wow, so very cool.
It's a great market, by the way.
Phenomenal market, yes.
I highly recommend
Yeah, it is a great market. Thank you,
I've been
Mr.
going there
Chu.
since 1954.
You're correct, it is a good market. So here is a map, and again, I'm probably not doing it much justice, but just many of the different sites and some of the things that we had talked about earlier. So Ardrossan, we had mentioned earlier how Jennifer's family is related to General Wayne, right? Which is really cool. You have, Radnor Meeting and school. You've got I had mentioned in the last class, where the Radnor Corporate, the financial center is, Lincoln Financial. It used to be Wyeth, and that whole area was a farm called Nantmeal, where Continental soldiers camped. Like, so cool. Just geek out, right? And just different maps here. We've got another site or two to share, and again, bear with me there. But these are some of the various men who, Light Horse Harry Lee, who Washington adored, who then, deserts his family after his son Robert E. Lee is born. And if there was a movie made, and you said, oh, Light Horse Harry Lee, who fights in the Revolution, and then his son fights to separate the Union, in the Civil War, people would say, all right, you're taking way too much poetic license. Daniel Morgan, Lord Sterling, who presented himself as an English lord, he's from New York. So again, yes, Jennifer.
Jim, is Phil here? He is here. Yes, so Phil's
Oh,
wife,
yeah,
Phil's
please.
wife is actually related to Lord Sterling.
Oh, sorry, Phil. Jennifer, you should have told me before I denigrated
I
them.
had forgotten until just now, I'm
I
sorry.
didn't denigrate him, I was sharing the truth. But no, just so much cool stuff here. Anthony Wayne, of course, Samuel Miles, who helped to, and Samuel Miles is a key player. His signature is on the currency of the day, which again is about as worthwhile, probably a little more worthwhile than my notes, as you can tell from my presentation. This is a memorial on, and you can read it, on Ardrossan, which commemorates the birth of General Anthony Wayne's mother, Elizabeth Iddings.
Yes.
So, I mean, just so neat.
Is that on the gatehouse?
Iddings. It's their spring house.
Spring house.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ardrossan Spring House.
Where is that on the property?
It's
Phil,
actually
do
pretty
you
close to
know?
the road, isn't it?
It's just west of the gatehouse, in the middle of a field on private property now.
I've not been. I mean,
No,
I will
haven't either. Yeah.
at some point, if they're not averse to having a strange man roaming the grounds. This, and this is cool, and I know we talked in the last presentation that this has been moved from its original spot, but this commemorates the march of the Continental Army of Conestoga Road in Garrett Hill, or Rosemont. This is right in front of the Rosemont Corporate Center on Conestoga Road. So cool, again, like, so neat, right? September 15th, 1777, 4 days after Brandywine. And for those, the nice thing about giving these talks is I get to throw any family fact in that I want. I had mentioned in the last that my 5th great-grandfather was actually wounded at Brandywine, served at Germantown, and was part of the Radnor picking. So why I like that, my wife is from Radnor, and I was able to say my family was in Radnor 200 years before hers. And I'm a Delco guy, I'm from Harrington. Got to rub that in a little bit, right? But just all, inscription, an outpost of George Washington's army encamped here in the winter of Valley Forge, 1777, 78.
Can I
Yes.
comment?
Please do.
One of the most obvious is the hanging rock.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's, I was,
Most obvious of all.
perfect segue. I did not pay this gentleman to bring this up, but it's the famous, what's the famous line? George Washington slept here, right? So all these sorts of things where he had been on the hanging rock, growing up I had heard, oh, he slept there, like, who knows? There are no signs. I slept in Radnor once or twice. There are no signs denoting that, but just so cool. Like, we drive by this stuff all the time, and it's part of our everyday life. And it's also hard to imagine, right, with everything that's been developed and built and overbuilt, although I love Radnor, just how things have changed. But a lot of it is still, you drive by and you just kind of sort of take it for granted. So really cool stuff. That might be the last one I want to show here. So we're at 7:25. We'll probably go another 20 minutes if everyone's okay with that. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what's happening in Radnor, and that's where we will wrap up today. I wanted to get in some facts and figures about Valley Forge. So we talk about Daniel Morgan. Pardon me, I get choked up when I talk about Daniel Morgan. He takes over, Washington assigns him to take over the Radnor picket, okay? So on the 23rd of December, Washington's at Valley Forge. Morgan's sharpshooters join Potter, who's manning the Pennsylvania militia, and they're basically sent to go out and harass Howe and the British. And again, the common theme here is the British are looking for supplies, the Americans are looking for supplies. And to the question earlier about them coming together, whether it's a skirmish or, hey, there are 10 of us and 8 of them, or whatever it may be. Light Horse Harry Lee is in the area at this time, right? He's writing notes to Washington about how lousy the horses are in Radnor. And he's saying, market availability is what's driving prices through the roof. The Congress had said to Washington, you can pay so much per horse, and Lee is saying, the local citizenry is holding out for the British to come because the British will pay more. And not because the British think the horses are better, they don't want the Americans to buy them. Right? So they're saying if we buy these horses, Washington can't use them. So it's all these sorts of things. So Washington, or pardon me, Morgan is sent out to harass Howe. The other recurring theme growing up, we heard the soldiers are starving, they're not eating, so local legend had it that, and it's been passed down through the Lewis family, was that Mrs. Levi Lewis of Holly Tree House cooked gruel in her kitchen and served it to the Continental troops at this time, any that would be coming through. So, yes, sir.
There's another local legend that at the end of the winter, they couldn't feed anybody.
Right.
The shad began running on the Schuylkill River.
Oh,
They
interesting.
had nets across the Schuylkill River.
Okay.
And they had all the fish and all the food that they could eat.
Which would have to be an improvement over gruel, right? At least gruel with some gut fill. And again, as one of 11, there were nights I felt like we were being fed gruel. My sisters might be able to back us up. But no, true, absolutely, very good point.
Because that's when the time of the year they begin to run.
Correct. So you've got, and think of just the nutritional value too. My wife's a dietitian, she'll be happy to know I included that. But think of the value of eating shad versus God knows what you're eating, right? So it's just a bit better. During Valley Forge, the average soldier ate half a pound of beef a day, which goes against what we heard growing up, right? And this is all based on quartermaster records at the time, right? Through things that are in the National Archives in the Pennsylvania, or at the Museum of the American Revolution, all these different sources. So yes, again, they had some tough times, but, and I'm not trying to say they did not, like I could not imagine being in their position from December of 1777 until June of 1778 when they take off, right? But it wasn't, as dire as it was made out to be, at least by the nuns at Gate of Heaven School in Dallas, Pennsylvania, in the 1970s when I was there. So here's the signaling system I talked about earlier. So cool. So from winter to spring, so basically the time that Washington is at Valley Forge, communications with Valley Forge were protected by the signal network. Sentinels posted high in trees from Radnor to headquarters, Valley Forge, but also up to Newtown Square. So there was a signal oak on the David Thomas farm along Newtown Road in Newtown Township, a Ronamink golf club. That's where this tree was, right? Crazy. It was the first link in the signaling chain, okay? It then went to a tree above Scott's farm, which became Tarleton, right, after the skirmish, in Easttown. That was Light Horse Harry Lee's outpost. It then went north to another tree on the east side of what is now Waterloo Road in Berlin, to a tree on the hill between Old Lancaster Road, or Conestoga Road, and what later became the Pennsylvania Railroad. So you can see how it's little by little, and again, like talk about heaven, no cell phones, no internet, right? How great is that? But no, truly, and then it went to another on a hill between Old State Road and Contention Lane, onto Signal Hill or Mount Joy, and then to Valley Forge. So just wild, right? Just right down the line. We talked about Easttown Township, Scott Farm, that's where Light Horse Harry Lee is. He ends up beating Bannister Tarleton, and it was more a raiding party. It wasn't, Tarleton and his guys are out looking for supplies. They run into Lee. Lee and his men kill a couple of British, and they take off, which is rare for Tarleton. He normally would stay the course of the fight, usually won, but here he does not. And then that's when Lee writes Washington to let him know that happens. And he says that, we've had this victory, we're watching your to make sure that none of these troops make their way up to Valley Forge. Morgan he initially is given command of the Radnor picket. He is then given command at Radnor Meeting House, which is basically the HQ.
What do you mean by picket? Is that?
So what we're talking, it's basically troops who are out. It's a force that will let you know, oh my gosh, the British are coming, right? So to that degree. And it's not a gigantic force, right? It's enough, almost like a
Reconnaissance group.
right, reconnaissance, or they would call them a lightning force, right? Where they're small, it's a small amount of men who can react quickly, get the heck out of Dodge if needed, or someone can let the next picket know, hey, troops are coming, those sorts of things.
What are they signaling? How much
So,
are they signaling?
Often.
1 light or 2?
Oh, well, so they would hold something that would illuminate. So what they also did, they did it in New Jersey. When Washington and his troops were basically running from New York down to Washington's Crossing. Of course, it's not Washington's Crossing at the time, but they used the same signaling system, and they would call them Washington's Beacon. So whether it was, sometimes what they would do, I think in New Jersey, it wasn't necessarily a tree. They'd be on a hill and they'd set a bonfire to say, and they'd say, oh my gosh, a fire's going, means the British are on the way. So you may not know how many are coming, but you know they're coming, so that you can prepare. Yes, sir.
How about during the daytime? Was it like a Western when they did the reflection?
Yeah, I doubt it, but yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I would think anything that would illuminate, yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I didn't think
How about
about it.
gunfire?
Could have been, yeah, could have been gunfire, and again, it could have been, if I was one of those signaling posts, I'd have been on the first horse out of Dodge saying, oh my God, they're coming, right? I mean, I will admit it, again, being taped, so it's for posterity. But, well, I can't imagine, and your question, sir, how many are in a picket? Could you imagine being in a small picket and you're learning that a British force is coming at you? I'd be like, oh my God, like, I'd be terrified. It had to be, it's like, this term was used during the Ken Burns documentary. Shelby Foote said it. He said in the Civil War, guys had long periods of boredom and tedium followed by short bursts of sheer terror. It had to be, relatively speaking, similar, right? If you're at Brandywine, if you're at Germantown, if you're at Breeds Hill, wherever it may be, and then you've got months where relatively nothing is happening. So just amazing stuff. Let me see here. So we talked about how Lee sticks it to Bannister Tarleton. What happens? Morgan ultimately is replaced. So there are, pardon me, successive replacements of leadership in Radnor. A Colonel Timothy Bigelow of the 15th Massachusetts Regiment succeeds Morgan at Radnor in late February at the picket. Bigelow's claim to fame, well, one, he served, but he was at Lexington and Concord when the whole thing started. So again, he was also taken prisoner at the Battle of Quebec and was exchanged later in the war, which allowed him to come down here. Bigelow sends or receives a letter from Washington on March 1st. So shortly after he takes leadership, Washington says the role of the Radnor outpost is unchanged. I'm not looking for you to fight the British. I am looking for you to keep them from coming in and taking supplies that we can use in Valley Forge. So again, it's not so much we need to punch them in the nose and fight them. We just need to thwart them from coming in and taking what we really feel is ours. Washington, and nobody talks like this, and of course this terminology means something different today, but Washington says that the Radnor and Newtown also had a picket. They must redouble their efforts to prevent, quote, every intercourse with Philadelphia and the British, right? No one talks like that, it's great. He then says to Bigelow, he says, what I need you to do is go out and find some cattle, because our supplies are running low, right? So he's got all these other, it's almost mundane, but it's the stuff that greases the wheels of the Army and keeps them fed and keeps them healthy and keeps them involved and allows them to train and cuts down on desertions. Bigelow is succeeded by Colonel Henry Beekman Livingston of New York on March 13th of 1778. So we're about 2 months out from Washington and the troops leaving Valley Forge. Livingston has a report from Robert Hanson Harrison at Valley Forge that it was thought that the British were preparing to move against Valley Forge. So a little bit more of an alarm, and that patrols should be vigilant and that the communication system should be ready to spread the word as quickly as possible. Livingston sends a note to Washington and says, let me send some guys out, and if we can pick off a few British at a time, we might find a British soldier carrying plans or carrying a letter or carrying some sort of communication that will give us a better idea of what's going on. Washington responds and writes that, quote, in order the better to enable you to attempt it, I've directed the commanding officer of Colonel Morgan's corps to repair as soon as he can to your post and in conjunction with your force to form such a plan as you may determine most likely to produce success. I shall only say that I would have you exceedingly cautious and secret in the scheme. So yeah, good idea, but be careful. Because if you get taken away, that's it, right? That picket's gone. So I need you to use your head. It's never known whether Livingston actually follows through on his plan. The Radnor picket is maintained through the Valley Forge encampment, except for there's a record of letters from June 10th, so really shortly before Washington and the troops are gone, that says, quote, by a flag to our advance post at Radnor, and from thence to headquarters the next morning, we have no more direct evidence of military or intelligence activity in Radnor. So it's basically the end right there of what's going to be happening in Radnor. So it's a short period, right? It's relatively, looking at the war. The war is more than 8 years long. We're talking about here 6 to 8 to 10 months if you include Brandywine, right? So let's say from September 1777 through June. What happens in May at Valley Forge before the troops depart? Word comes about the French becoming allies of the Continental Army because of what happened at Saratoga. And it's here that you will begin to see, particularly once Washington, so after Monmouth Courthouse, right, as the British are heading up to New York, Washington ultimately heads north, but he sends some of his best generals south for the Southern campaign. And truly, there are no major battles there's the siege of Savannah, of Charleston, of some of those key urban areas. But what you see is Greene spectacularly says, I'm going to string the British out and make them chase me, to extend their supply lines and make it more difficult for them to feed their troops, to house their troops, to arm couldn't think of the word, arm their troops. And Morgan, who is, we had talked about this earlier, the ungentlemanly way that the Americans fought, right? They wouldn't stand there and line up and shoot 2 rounds and then wait for the British to shoot 2 rounds. They're hiding behind fence posts and things like this. What Morgan does, and I know it's not with what we're concerned with here, but Morgan uses the topography of the South to the Americans' advantage because he knows that the British are a superior force. And he's saying, if I can surprise them, if I can catch them off guard, if I can make them march far and use a river to their back to keep them from retreating, if I make them fight us, on our terms, then we can do some damage here, and that's what happens. So news about the French alliance comes to Valley Forge on the 5th of May. 6 weeks later, the British say, all right, to your question, sir, nothing's happening here. Let's get out of here. So they start to head up to New York, and that's when Washington and the American troops say, we're going to follow them. And Monmouth Courthouse happens, which is a huge psychological victory because it shows Washington, although, the Americans, under General Lee, not Light Horse Harry, but under Charles Lee doesn't follow the battle plan at Monmouth, and his troops are retreating. Washington rides out in the middle of them, retreating with his sword drawn, and says, turn around, you know what's. And Washington's staff is terrified because they think he's going to be killed. But what Washington does is he gets his men to coalesce and fight the British, and that's where the British say, this is not the same force that we fought in the past. So I'm going to take a quick sip of water. We're going to end there. Questions, comments, anything, but before we end, thank you, Tad, for your words about your cousin. Thank you, Jennifer and Radnor Historical Society, and thank you, Pam and Radnor Memorial Library for this opportunity. And thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.
Am I okay here, David? I was remiss, and I'm still hyped up on the sugar from the ice cream we made this morning. Then I had a soda right before we came. That wasn't smart. I was remiss in not thanking Pam for doing this for us at the last minute. Obviously, our plan had been to be at the Finley House, and as it kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and the people who were staying with me from Northwest Ohio kept saying, oh, it's so hot here, what's going on? And it was reminding me that not everyone can tolerate it the way some of us can, so we made the plan over the weekend to change, and we'll do the same thing next month. If, the plan will be to be at the Finley House, but if it doesn't work, if it gets too hot, I'll send a message out on Sunday, I'll send one out on Monday, I'll post it on our social medias, so please keep an eye out for that. But again, thank you, Pam, for making all of this happen at the last minute. I appreciate your air conditioning more than you could ever imagine.
So one thing I wanted to bring up, and I'm sorry that you had to see me open my email, but this is the author. So Jennifer and I worked together on the education subcommittee for the, taking a deep breath so I can say it all in one breath, the America PA 250 Delco Commission. And what this is to celebrate the semi-quincentennial in 2026 of America's founding. I've read this book, it's awesome. Of course, everything's awesome that I talk about with history, but no, Dr. Norton is the real deal. She's a Pulitzer finalist. She is, and as Jennifer said, she'll send this information out, but she is coming in to speak about this book. This book, what we've done, and I'm sure there's a copy available here. If there is not, our subcommittee has ordered copies for every library in the Delaware County system. There will be book clubs in a bag where some libraries are going to have book discussions and things like that. And if you're lucky enough, you'll get to hear me talk about this. If not, you'll do it on your own, which might be better. But Dr. Norton is coming in She'll be speaking at Widener on November 17th, which is a Sunday. I think we checked, are the Eagles off that day?
They're either off or they're not playing.
Yeah, we made sure that was extremely important. And hopefully the Phillies have won the World Series by then. But it's a great book. She's a very interesting woman. She's actually going to be in Philadelphia that weekend for another, big muckety-muck, very scientific terms, historical conference. And she was thrilled to say, yes, I will absolutely come and speak about the book. So we will send more information out about this. But if you go to America, if you type any of those words in succession, you can mix them up. It'll take you to the information, and it's folks who, like Jennifer and I, love history, and we just want to, we share our passion, but it's a way to help commemorate every county in the United States has their own group. So Chester County has one, Montgomery County has one. Of course, Philadelphia, that's going to be the bee's knees, right, for the 250th anniversary. But the thought is, much like the bicentennial, when initially it was thought all the action was going to be in Philadelphia, after the bicentennial, the impact was really at the local level. So it was Radnor and Wayne and Havertown and all, everyone's individual towns doing what they were doing to commemorate the anniversary that had a bigger impact. Not to say that Philadelphia's didn't, it absolutely did, but a lot more local reach, and there's a lot more coordination here to recognize the 250th than there was even the bicentennial. So be on the lookout, but if you're able to make it, highly recommend it. It's a great event, free. Widener has a small reception and a book signing after. We work with Main Point Books. They order numerous books, and Dr. Norton will sign afterwards, but really, really cool stuff. So, and before we end, any questions, any comments, please, about what I tried to talk about? Anyone? Yes, Lynn.
The Revolutionary War book that you spoke of tonight, when Bill Graham revised it, he added a fold-out map that has the signal trees of it's not just Radnor, because all the way up to Valley Forge and beyond, and it just gives you a real idea of what was going on and
Yes.
where the action was.
No, well, and Phil, well done. I didn't mention it earlier. As I said, I gave your wife's relative a hard time, but no, just and what Mr. Dowd started with, but what Phil added to it. Really, it's well worth it. It's $15, and it goes to the Historical Society, right? But it's just such a great read, and I've read it several times, and I totally forgot about the map. But just again, as a geek, right up my alley. But really cool, especially for those of you living in the area and saying, oh my gosh, this is a block away or a mile away or whatever it may be. So good stuff. Thanks, Lynn. All right, thank you all. Again, appreciate it. Stay cool. Have a good night.